Good morning. Thanks for joining me. Sorry I'm right on time. Usually I like to hop on a few minutes beforehand. Um, so today we are going to be going over the home close contingency, the bump clause, and secondary offers. So this will be kind of more of a traditional training that I'm used to in terms of just like sticking straight to the contract, and going kind of over it line by line. Um, so I feel like this is one that, as newer agents, we wouldn't handle this um, right off the bat. So I thought this would be a good training for our seasoned guys. So, okay, let's get to it. And then, as always, stop with questions at any time. And we can also reserve a little time for just general questions too, if either of you have any. So, Um, okay, so the closing of the buyer's property contingency. So, um, it might be the case where your buyer needs to sell their home in order to do the purchase of the next one. So, they need to get the proceeds from the sale of their current residence out in order to move forward with what they want to purchase, where their next move. Um, so I feel like in terms of writing home close contingencies in our competitive markets, we don't see them too often these days because with how highly competitive it has been, um, we're just kind of coaching buyers to try and do plan B right off the bat, in terms of financing, like, getting it squared away with their lenders. Can we possibly do a bridge loan? I kind of always like to speak to the market of the moment with this kind of thing, just again, to try and like coach our buyers on the fact that this is not ideal for a seller to accept an offer with a home close contingency. So, if I have a buyer who needs to do a home close contingency, oftentimes I'm looking for inventory that has been sitting for a minute, first, because that might be just more acceptable to a seller, because they have been on the market for a minute or so. If it's something where it's going to be highly competitive, a seller is not going to want to accept an offer with a home close contingency. So it would be really hard to get that to go. So, again, so just kind of keep that in mind as we're coaching our buyers and you're running into new buyers and, looking at what their financial situation is. Obviously their lender is working with them closely, more closely with them on that, but just mapping out pathways forward. So, all right. Well, so if you are going to include a home close contingency, the section starts at 328. This is page 6 of the offer. As always, you would be marking it with an X if you're going to be including it. So, and it just right off the bat reads, this offer is contingent upon the closing of the sale of the buyer's property located at, and you would put in their primary residence here. Um, no later than, and then you would be choosing the time frame in which they're expressing to the seller, this will be closed, um, and then we can move forward. So oftentimes, this date is just matching what the close date is of the home that they want to purchase. So, whatever close date you had chosen here will likely match up here. And, if there is a home close contingency, the goal is to close on this, maybe in the morning, and then we would close on, when I say this, we'd be closing on the primary residence and then maybe closing in the afternoon on this next purchase. So, for the purposes of this, I will just match what we put in above. If the closing does not occur by the deadline, this offer shall become null and void unless the buyer delivers to the seller on or before that deadline reasonable written verification from a financial institution or third party that the buyer has at the time of verification sufficient funds to close, or a proof of bridge loan financing. Delivery of verification or proof of bridge loan shall not extend the closing date for this offer. So a couple things in there. Um, it used to be a lot more gray, this language, in terms of what happened if this date came and went and the primary residence did not close. Um, Now it's pretty black and white. So if this does not close by this date, then the offer is just null and void. But it allows for the buyer to deliver a bridge loan, evidence of a bridge loan, or other form of proof of funds. So it's just nice that now that it is black and white, unless otherwise stated through, again, a proof of funds or a bridge loan. And then here, delivery of verification or proof of bridge loan shall not extend the closing date for this offer. So if that buyer has to get a bridge loan, um, it doesn't automatically mean, and if there's an underwriting process with that, I mean, it doesn't automatically mean that the buyer is allowed to just extend closing for this offer. So kind of just be aware of that in terms of planning purposes. So, I'm always coaching buyers. If we do have to do a home close contingency, start the conversation on a bridge loan in the event that we need to deliver evidence for that. And when we get into the bump clause scenario, I will explain that further. But we always want to have our ducks in a row in the event we need to pull the trigger on these things, on these plan Bs. So, okay, so that section is pretty straightforward. The bump clause now, so as I was saying before, um, the the likelihood that it's not attractive to a seller to accept an offer with a home close contingency, right? So the inclusion of a bump clause helps it make it more seller friendly. So in essence, what the bump clause does is it lets the seller keep marketing their property. So we get to keep it active in the MLS, and they can accept they can accept a secondary offer, which a seller is always able to accept a secondary offer. But with this bump clause, what we can do is now accept a secondary offer and then send what's called a bump clause notice to this buyer and let them know, okay, you have to lift this home close contingency or I'm going to move on to this secondary buyer. So it just makes the acceptance of a home close contingency just a little less risky for a seller. So a bump clause now, and I'll go over the language, it is mostly tied to, or most often tied to, a home close contingency. There are cases when we can use a bump clause even if a home close contingency is not a part of the offer. So I can kind of describe those one-off scenarios. And it's more for kind of like these creative provisions that a buyer might need. Again, in the spirit of kind of working with the seller, like I've got a weird situation that I need to handle, much like a home close contingency. Um, and to help you want to accept my offer, how about if we include a bump clause? So, but okay, this is how the language reads exactly. So again, you would mark it with an X. So if the seller accepts a bona fide secondary offer, the seller may give written notice to the buyer that another offer has been accepted. If the buyer does not deliver to the seller the documentation listed below, and that documentation is bullet point 3, within blank hours, and it defaults to 72, After the buyer's actual receipt of the notice, the offer shall be null and void. So buyer must deliver the following. So if that buyer, the buyer who wrote this offer, the primary buyer, receives this bump notice, again from the seller stating, I've accepted another offer. Now I want you, Mr. Buyer number one, to provide to me a waiver of your home close contingency. So that's bullet point one. And I want you to deliver to me a proof of bridge loan financing or another form of proof of funds. And you've got 72 hours to do that. And if you cannot do that, then I'm going to, this offer is null and void and move on to the secondary buyer. So that's how that works. So back to my saying, if we are including a home close contingency, and our hope is that this primary residence sells before we close on this secondary residence, the second home, then we definitely want to get ducks in a row for a bridge loan in the event that we need to pull out this evidence of it in order to move forward with the primary offer. It just might be the case that the buyer does not qualify for a bridge loan. And in that case, then we would still need to move on. But again, you don't want to be blindsided at the last minute with having to get a lender to approve a bridge loan or get a pre-approval for a bridge loan. So, and then this bullet point two, this is where I was stating before that maybe it's not tied to a home close contingency. So maybe, the example that I've used in the past, I always thought this was a good example. A buyer, this is a real life example. A buyer of ours, it was a KW agent, wanted to write on a home that was in pretty poor shape, pretty rough shape. And investors were not touching it. It had been sitting on the market for a while. This buyer came along and said, we want to write an offer on this, but we want 2 weeks to have contractors come in and bid out the things that we need done to the home. And if it exceeds our budget, we do not want to move forward. So, but if it does fall under our budget, then we would move forward. So the seller had hesitancy accepting an offer with that contingency because their home would potentially be sitting off the market for 2 whole weeks. So we came up with, well, why don't we include a bump clause? So in that case, then, if a secondary offer were to come in and that seller was going to deliver a notice to the primary buyer to lift their waiving their contingency for the 2 week, I'm just making this up, but or just quickly doing this, for the 2 week estimate period, we'll call it. So again, no home close contingency, but this weird one-off contingency to get these estimates. So that's a kind of a way that you could use this bump clause in kind of these really one-off rare circumstances. So, okay, any questions on this so far? Okay. All right, then the secondary offer provision. So this all kind of ties it together. First, I'll say a secondary offer can be made at any time. So you might have a buyer who sees they see a home that's like it's their dream home, but there's an accepted offer on it already. But they're in a position where they could just wait it out and see if anything happens with that first buyer. So it might be the case where a buyer is making a secondary offer on a home that does not have, that the primary buyer does not have a home close contingency, and they're really just They're just like, let's just see. Maybe it falls apart on inspection or appraisal or something. Most of the time, though, a secondary offer is being submitted because that second buyer knows that the primary buyer has a bump clause. So that is the one provision that a listing agent can share with another agent. Um, so if I had a listing that we accepted an offer with a home close contingency and a bump clause, I can say to that other potential buyer's agent, there is a bump clause, so it would be worth your time to write an offer. Um, and oftentimes, if there is a bump clause included, we're actually just listing agents are actually just including that right into the um, private remarks on the MLS. Bump clause, we encourage secondary offers. So, as a listing agent, keep that in mind. You'd want to know to do that. Um, so again, that's usually the case when a secondary offer is being made because we know that that buyer might actually have a shot at it. Okay, so how this reads is line 348. You'll mark it with an X. This offer is secondary to a prior accepted offer. This offer shall become primary upon delivery of written notice to the buyer that this offer is primary. So, if that seller was able to move this offer into primary position, they're just literally going to send a notice over saying this offer is now in primary position. Unless otherwise provided, the seller is not obligated to give the buyer notice prior to any deadline, nor is any particular secondary buyer given the right to be made primary ahead of other secondary buyers. So this is important. If you have a listing, you can gather as many secondary offers as you want. And just because a secondary offer came in ahead of another one, it doesn't mean that that seller is obligated to accept or move that other secondary offer into primary position. So I could, as a listing agent, as a seller, that seller can accept as many as possible, kind of have them lined up. And then, should the primary deal fall apart, then they've got their pick of the litter on who they would want to move into primary position. So, um, it's important to know that buyer's agents, then knowing that language is in there, if I'm an agent writing a secondary offer, I might want to write in there, this offer shall be made primary ahead of all other offers because I want to protect my buyer. Like, why are we doing this if we don't know that we could be made in secondary position? Um, so just kind of keep that in mind. Again, I think also I just want you guys to hear, like, take this in, and then, if you guys do run into these scenarios, you can call the compliance hotline or call your broker and kind of get these advice on how to handle some of this stuff. So, um, okay, so then buyer may declare this offer null and void by delivering written notice of withdrawal to the seller prior to delivery of seller's notice that this offer is primary. I'm going to go on to the next sentence and then tie it back together. Buyer may not deliver notice of withdrawal earlier than, and it defaults to 7 days after acceptance of this offer. So what that means is, with this deadline in there, that buyer is saying to the seller, okay, I'm going to sit in secondary position. I'm going to sit in secondary position for at least 7 days. Once that seventh day is up, then I have an opportunity to withdraw from secondary position. But I'm telling you, Mr. Seller, that I am committed to you for these first 7 days. So that means that that buyer cannot write an offer on anything else for that first 7 days. And this is a negotiation point as well. So you, as a buyer's agent, I might want to see this as like 3 days. As a seller, they're going to want to see it as many days as possible. But again, it defaults to 7. Um, and once that seventh day is up, so we move on to day 8. what happens then is that nothing happens in terms of now the buyer is still just hanging out in secondary position. Um, and if they want to now serve a notice to the seller withdrawing from secondary position, they can. But if they don't do anything at all, then they're still just hanging out in secondary position. So, we just had a case of in my personal business, my business partner, she wrote an offer on a home in Glendale, secondary offer. They got it accepted. The seller, I think, wanted 10 days, and I think they were trying to work through an inspection contingency. Um, and if the inspection was going to fall apart, then they could move us into secondary position. But that 10th day came, nothing happened. Buyer was still fine to just hang out in secondary position. And I think that their deadline was up midweek last week. The buyer, though, found something this past Sunday that they wanted to write an offer in on. So my business partner served a notice to the listing agent saying, we are now withdrawing. You have not moved us into primary. So we're withdrawing. And then now our buyer, my business partner and her buyer were able to um, deliver an offer to another home, which got accepted. Um, so that's how that all works. And in terms of this deadline and how it kind of coincides with a bump clause, if as a buyer's agent, you're writing an offer as a secondary offer, I would be asking the listing agent, okay, if there's a bump clause, how much time do you need to deliver, or how much time does that other primary buyer have to answer if you're serving a bump notice? Because we want to make sure that that this date is at least at 3 days or above. Or actually, the listing agent is going to want to make sure that they have at least that 3 days or above because we don't want this secondary buyer to withdraw while we're waiting for the primary buyer to figure out whether or not they're going to move forward or not. Because it could be the case that we withdraw from secondary position and this buyer cannot move forward, and then then that listing has no offer at all. So that's again more of a data point that the listing agent is going to want to make sure that these match up. So, gets a little muddy, but that's how they kind of all work together. And again, these can all work independently of a home closing contingency, but most often, again, secondary offers are only being written on homes with bump clauses that include home close contingencies. So, um, another last point on this, all other offer deadlines that run from acceptance shall run from the time this offer becomes primary. So this is important to know. Um, if a secondary offer is accepted, deadlines do not start until or if it becomes a primary offer. So that secondary buyer does not have to submit earnest money. They do not have to like get an inspection going. Because again, only until it turns into a primary offer, if it turns into a primary offer, would they get the ball rolling on all of that stuff. So, all right, any questions?
I have a quick question. You had
Yes.
mentioned on when writing for a secondary offer to put
hmm
in move this one to primary. Where would you write that in the contract?
I would put that in the additional provisions.
Okay,
So that
thank
was
you.
back to my example with my business partner. She included that in her offer because there was more than one secondary offer coming in, and I was like, we got to include that because otherwise we will have a very upset buyer, or we have to at least attempt it. A listing agent,
Sure.
yeah, a listing agent might say, no, we're gonna keep as many secondary offers as possible, but we got to the attempt the request. So. But yeah, it would really literally just be in the additional provisions. This offer shall be made primary above all other secondary offers. Good question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you guys as always. I always like to check what we were doing um, next week. Let's see here. So next week we'll be doing pre-market listings and Wisconsin law. So that'll be a good one. And then water access rights on the 27th. Okay. Well, good to be with you guys always. Thank you again for showing up. We really appreciate it. Have a great day.